the adult enrichment on the sacraments. Last week, we tried to give an overview of the development of sacraments in the church, how we depend as Catholics not just on revelation in Scripture, but a tradition of teaching in the church down through the centuries, and how that practices of various cultures through the history of the church, as the Roman Empire disappeared and various other cultures came into play, how practices changed and differed, and how the church teaching on the seven sacraments didn't solidify until the Council of Trent, until actually the 13th century. And then the church said there are other ways, but these seven are the ones that we formalize as sacraments. And what we're going to do today is try to take three of them, baptism, Eucharist, and confirmation, and try to look at the development of those three in the history of the church. We have as a frame within we're going to work, we use the Baltimore Catechism in a sense. Sacraments are outward signs instituted by Christ to give grace. And we all say that with a certain amount of confidence. And yet, instituted by Christ doesn't mean that Jesus necessarily established each one the way we're experiencing it now. And we'll try to show that. But even in the Eucharist, in baptism, and the pouring of water, we never find him pouring water directly. He was baptized by John, and his apostles went out and baptized in his name. But if we're going to try to verify the baptism that we understand in the church today as going back to Jesus doing the same thing, we're going to be hard pressed. Did he establish the sacrament? Yeah. Did he dictate that the apostles should go out and baptize all nations? Yes. But what did he mean by that? And what do we mean by that? Well, that's developmental over the centuries. And it may continue to develop. Who knows? I'm not going to be around, but that's somebody else's problem. But the point is that things move and shift. And that doesn't mean that the essential teaching changes. If we're going to look at sacraments, then let's look at it in two ways. It's almost like two prongs. One is the sacraments from God's point of view, that God, through the sacraments, is sharing his divine life. That's what the definition is. It's a mysterious sharing in God's life. Well, how do I share in God's life? Well, I'm not quite sure, except through Jesus' teaching. It's by loving. God defines himself as love. And then when I experience that in my life, I'm experiencing God. And that's what the sacraments are supposed to be doing for us in a very functional, strict communication on a given moment. It's that love relationship that God calls us through the teaching of Jesus, that he calls us to friendship. He uses in John's gospel. I call you friend, not servant any longer. And you are my friends when you do what I command you. That is to love one another. Simple, except I keep forgetting, I keep drifting, I keep getting caught up in my own needs. And so the sacraments are developed into moments in that relationship. Some of them not repeated, like baptism. Some of them are repeated, like Eucharist or penance. Confirmation is once. It's the reason for the moment. And from God's point of view, he's always sharing himself, his love. From the recipient's point of view, from my point of view, it's really experiencing the God's friendship in that moment the way I need it. And that's something we want to keep in the back of our minds. From God's point of view, it's always his love. The individual sacrament for that moment in the ongoing relationship, it has a specific purpose. And I have to be conscious of that. Whatever the sacrament is offering me, it's offering it me. Whether I accept it or not, that's up to it. If I come to a sacrament and don't accept it or focus on it, or if I don't receive it, it just means that at that moment in relationship, perhaps a moment where I really need a conscious sharing in God's love, then I don't. I just ignore it. It doesn't mean God doesn't love me. Doesn't mean any of that. So what we find then in the early church through baptism is, what is it that Jesus meant by that? Well, the first teaching on the sacrament of baptism is that it was an initiation, that if you go through the tradition of the apostolic times, they were part of the Jewish faith. They considered themselves Jewish. Jesus takes the Last Supper, which is a Jewish ritual of Passover, and he makes it something that is specifically for his followers. He uses the frame of the tradition of the Passover meal, and then in the middle of it changes it and incorporates what we have in the sacrament of the Eucharist. With this Last Supper, in the middle of it, he stops, he gets up, and he takes water, and he goes around and washes the feet of each disciple. That's not part of the Passover ritual. That's something Jesus introduces. That's part of what he's trying to do. In the sacrament of baptism, he's trying to get us to understand that we are now incorporated in a relationship, and that the relationship is fed and nurtured. But that part of the relationship is not necessarily just receiving, but also doing. That we're becoming part of a community, that we're celebrating this membership of love, of relationship in this meal, in this moment. And he filters in, if you will, what we call the washing of the feet. There are some people who might say that perhaps that should have been one of the sacraments. Instead of pick one you don't like, drop it and put this one in, or make it 8. But it isn't. But it would not be a bad idea that every once in a while, at least, we celebrate the washing of the feet in some way. But again, in Jesus's time, it was a custom when you came in from dusty roads in bare feet with sandals, I guess. It was customary for the host to make sure that your feet got washed. And so it was very much a part of their experience. It's not ours. If we were going to have that as a sacrament, we would have to then find a different way. It would have evolved differently by now. So while the externals may change, and while there may be shifting and picking and choosing over centuries, it doesn't mean that the essence of the sacrament changes. God is still sharing his love, that what we believe is 7 sacraments are dictated by the teaching of the church, built up over centuries of tradition and practice. It doesn't change the meaning. It doesn't necessarily even change the experience of God's love, but it does change our consciousness, our awareness. It allows us to participate more, because what we're doing has more meaning to us. That what I'm doing in this sacrament or that sacrament is trying to make personal what God is offering to me and to you. I may do it differently at this moment from you. And so we go to communion, or we receive sacrament of reconciliation, and we go down that whole list, and we say, is one supposed to go to communion, for example? Somewhere along the line, we've got it to the point where we've twisted it. Jesus offers us, take this and eat it. This is my body. This is my blood. It's a gift. It's my sign of love. But that's the whole idea of redemption. It's a gift. God forgives us. God loves us. And what does he want us to do? Accept it and witness to that love. What have we done? Well, good luck in trying to change it, by the way. We've got it in our heads that we have to earn it. that we're not good enough to receive the gift of love from God. And therefore, when I'm not perfect, when I'm not keeping all the rules, when I'm not whatever it is, I'm not worthy of this. And so people don't go to communion. A lot of people don't go to communion because they're not worthy. And I don't know how you get worthy if you don't go to communion. It depends on how I'm listening. It depends on how I'm hearing what God is doing. And then I'll react to that in a certain way. It doesn't mean that I'm disrespectful or have no consciousness of the sacredness of the Eucharist. But it's something to remind me that God is already living here. And so there's all sorts of ways. If you look at church on a Sunday or during the week, people express their adoration in so many different ways. Some sit there quietly. Some have their hands out. Some are on their knees. Some are practically lying, well, not practically, they're lying on the ground. And at this stage, I'm lucky I can move. But however one expresses, it's an externalizing of what is internal, that I believe God is there. And this is the way I express it. Is the way you do it the way I want to do it? Doesn't matter. But the question is, do I know what God is doing? And am I accepting that? Am I accepting his love? And so in the beginning of the church, in the early days, these were all adults. People were listening, crowds coming. We don't see or hear little children. We see a lot of mature people. I don't know how old they were, but they weren't kids. And the idea was that they would listen, they would gain faith in Jesus and his teaching, and they'd want to be his followers. And so in order to become that, baptism became part of the ritual. But then in the early church, it was the apostles, or we would call them bishops. And so that once a year, generally speaking, they would have this Eucharist celebration, this meal. And at that meal, new members would be baptized, anointed, signified as new members and followers of Jesus. And then they would celebrate Eucharist at the same time. And then that was a somewhat simple ceremony. The Eucharistic meal could be repeated and was, but always with the bishop or with the leader of the community, always on special occasions. It wasn't done every day the way we have it. As a matter of fact, this is a relatively recent development in the history where Mass is celebrated so frequently. But the point is that it was celebrated and it became then more ritualized, as not, we wouldn't recognize the Mass during the apostolic time. It was usually during a meal. It was something similar to the Passover in a way. But the Eucharist was part of it. And when it was formalized in the community for new members, baptism would be integrated. And that's the way that developed. Again, we go through the patristic period, we get into the Middle Ages, we find in different cultures, as the church spreads, different practices, people celebrate differently, and those differences were incorporated. And so all of a sudden, we find that now we have adults who are members, followers of Jesus. Now, I'm oversimplifying this, but follow. And then after 150 years, something like that, these adults are getting married, having children. What about the kids? Well, if I understand baptism back then, it was a one-time deal. You got signed as a member, a follower of Jesus. Your sins were washed away, and it was a one-time deal. And so there was a practice happening that, for example, Augustine or Tertullian or Constantine, the emperor, they would wait until they were near death. I don't know how they knew that, but they would wait until they got older. And then they would get baptized because they didn't want to get baptized and then sin. Augustine was great for that. He was leading, it seemed to me, a rather normal life. He had a woman he was living with, he had a child, and then finally he converts and he wants to become Christian. But a baptism means he's going to be sinless. And he decides, well, I better wait. And then he realizes that isn't practical at all. That's not what the essence of the sacrament is. And so baptism, and then we have these families coming along. What about the children? Can they be baptized? Well, why don't you wait till they grow up a little bit? And it became very confused. Different parts of the world celebrated differently. Eventually, they would say, well, infant baptism became more and more of a practice. And adult baptism, as Augustine experienced it, became less. But that took hundreds of years to develop. And then the sacraments itself, as the numbers of members of what we would call the Christian community or the church, as they increased, then it was impossible for the relatively few number of bishops to be present at the celebration of baptisms and Eucharist, even once a year. And so communities would go for long periods without the opportunity of baptism or of Eucharist. And so eventually priests would celebrate the Eucharist and baptism. That with the advent of infant baptism, it was done more frequently because the numbers were there. And so the whole practice that you and I are more used to started to come more accepted in different parts of the world. And so it's something that it's hard for you and me, perhaps, to get hold of, because it's always been this way, we think. I grew up in the 40s in grade school, and I've mentioned this before. On the blackboard was a sign, I guess in all the classrooms, that the Eucharist, or the Mass, not the Eucharist, the Mass was celebrated, the same Mass, Latin, was celebrated every minute in every part of the world somewhere. And that was the universal church, the unity, wow. But in the 40s, young men were coming back from the military, and they were experiencing that wasn't true. That not only was it not celebrated the same everywhere, but it wasn't celebrated every minute. That was a nice image, and fine. But the point is that that's not what happened. That Mass in the Eastern Rite was celebrated in a language other than Latin. That Latin came in through European culture, that we are a product of European culture. Those who might be from the East and different kinds of culture would have different practices. And so you have all of this going on and on and on. And once a practice gets set, once it gets locked in, it becomes something that I think was always this way, that it came from Jesus down to Brooklyn in 1945. Hardly nothing came to Brooklyn from Jesus in 1945, except maybe the Dodgers. But the point is that we do have this attitude without consciously thinking about it. And then once we're reintroduced to something saying, well, it wasn't this way. Whoa, what do you mean? How can it be different? We get it from Jesus to our community. Well, not until it's gone through a lot of communities, a lot of cultures, a lot of evolution. That's why, until the Council of Trent, when after the Protestant Reformation, the church kind of grouped in defense from the attack of the Protestant leaders. And a lot of what the Protestant leaders, Martin Luther especially, were criticizing were valid criticisms. There was a lot of abuse going on in the church culturally. And so their complaints, if you will, were valid. And the church then regrouped, and now it became, well, we're right and you're wrong on both sides, I might add. And therefore, this is the way it is. And here are the 7 sacraments. You've got to follow those 7. You got to do them this way. You have matter and form. You have the matter, water. You have the form. I baptize you in the name of the Father. Must be poured on the forehead, and on and on and on. Because we didn't do immersion anymore with great regularity. It was infants, so the water had to be poured on the forehead. And the patterns change, but very, very gradually. But the meaning doesn't. Again, from God's point, baptism was a formal welcoming in relationship. It's not the beginning from God's point of view. It is from my point of view. When I do a baptism, not too often now, but when I would do them more frequently, I would say to the parents and godparents that you're bringing this child to church because you believe that God loves this child from the moment of conception. They're not little sinners. That was the practice and the theology for a while. It was almost logical. Well, if you need baptism to become part of God's love, if you need to get in the state of grace, so to speak, and then you have to be baptized. Or else if you die, you go, well, where do you go? Is God going to put you in hell as an infant? I don't think so. So we put limbo out there as a rational explanation. And even that never set well. Something wrong with the thought process. But then eventually we realized that God, from God's point of view, he's always loving. It's when the parents, as they say, bring their children and the godparents to the church for baptism, it's saying, I believe God has always loved this child. And I want this child to grow up knowing what that means. So I'm going to take the responsibility for speaking for this child and say yes from the child's point of view to God's love. Not make God love him, that's or her. That's always there. And so then how do I do that as a parent, a godparent? By example, by loving them. I remember this story, I just told it recently. A family of 4 had 2 older girls, then a boy, then a girl, and the third girl was Down syndrome. And the mother was explaining to the 2 girls that Maureen, when she comes home from the hospital, will not be able to run around the way you're used to. She won't be able to do things the way you're used to. She won't speak as quickly. And the mother was going down. And finally, the older girl, who was like 9 or 10, said, can Maureen love? And the mother says, oh, yeah. And then the girl said, well, we'll just love her. That was a moment. And the girl is 32 now. That was a moment where I thought, whoa, that's what baptism is. Well, you want to love God? Yeah, because God's always loved you. There's a very different meaning then. It's not that, it's not something I'm earning. You know, God will continue to love me if I go to church every Sunday. God will continue to love me if I say the prayers. If I don't meet on Friday, let me go down the list. God becomes a pain, frankly. And it's me that's the pain because I'm not getting behind it. I'm not remembering the frame. I'm remembering what I think is my experience. I'm starting to put on to God what I would do as a human being. I become demanding. I become sometimes unforgiving, unbending, and so forth. So it's important to get a sense that what we live in here in the development and evolution of church and sacraments are something that has beauty to it, but it requires me to work at it. Infant baptism ushered in something where I had to think, well, the church had to think more about what am I really saying here? Am I listening to God or am I listening to me? Well, baptism, it's something I earn. Once I get it, I can't make a mistake. That's what the early church thought. So when that doesn't work, I'm going to have to rethink it, have to listen. What is Jesus saying? And so on and on we go to where we understand that the commandment of Jesus is to love. It's not to earn. Where he keeps saying, we just had it last Sunday. God sent Jesus into the world not to condemn it, He wants to let you know that he loves the world. That means you and me. It means the creation, means every human being. It's important. It makes that not our theology wrong. So it may mean I have to reapproach it. I have to rethink it. And so the church does that continually, although we think it doesn't. And so you got, for example, baptism, and you have Eucharist, and then you have confirmation. Now, what happened with confirmation, and here I'm going to admit that this may be giving confirmation short shrift, but it always gets short shrift. Someone described confirmation as a sacrament that's looking for theology. We always hook it on to something. And by that I mean, originally it was part of the baptismal ceremony. The bishop, who always did the baptisms in the early church, would anoint with the chrism. And therefore that would be the confirmation part of the baptism. And it was all kind of one. And the Eucharist was an extension of that, thanking God in the celebration of the Eucharist. Eventually, when the bishops weren't present for the ceremony, then confirmation, the local priest couldn't anoint with the chrism because he wasn't a bishop. Even now, I think it's Pentecost, if I'm the pastor or if I have somebody coming for instruction, I have to write to the bishop to get permission to confirm them. And he'll give it, but I can't just do it. Well, that's what happened eventually when bishops weren't available because baptisms, too many people, repeated too often. Eventually, confirmation got separated. And then now it's looking, well, where does it fit? What does it do? If baptism puts an indelible mark on the soul, if we're friends of God, if God loves us unconditionally, what am I getting in confirmation? What's the point of it? Well, then you start, well, let me think this one up, see if this works. And so eventually confirmation became separated. And then like we're experiencing it now, you'd be hard pressed to get an age for confirmation. It's usually around 7th grade. What is in this parish? 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade. Some parishes 10th. I think it should be senior high school because it's become a graduation moment. Once you get confirmed, you don't have to go to a church anymore. You don't have to go to instruction. We've got it as a ceremony that's liberating. I'm finished. Yay. If you ask any of the kids in the grade school, that's what about confirmation? Well, I don't have to come anymore. Hey, yay. And if it's school, I have sympathy for that. But that's not what it's supposed to be. That what I'm looking for here is for the individual to take the responsibility that the parents took at his baptism or her baptism. When mom and dad said, I'm speaking for you here, you 3-month-old baby, I'm speaking for you here. I'm introducing you as a friend of God. Now you're coming to a point, wherever that is, where you should take responsibility for friendship, for relationship on yourself. And God will provide the strength necessary. We have to keep an understanding that this thing is work, that what Jesus invites us to is a relationship, a friendship. And if I'm going to be in on that, it means I got to work at it. I can't take it for granted. I need strength. I have to make choices. Sometimes those choices are very difficult. And that always shifts depending on where I am in my journey. I understand friendship at age 7 in a certain way. Everybody's friends, everybody. And I got to be 13, 14, 15, whatever the age is. And relationships are very confusing, very difficult. I don't know how to do them. That's where it gets funny. How do you be a friend at 13 or 14? If you're a guy, how do you become a friend with a girl? Probably stupidly, how do you do that? You learn. You learn by working at it. Hopefully, your examples from family have made your choices easier, healthier, but not always. And sometimes I have to learn by failing, by rejection. There's nothing worse than an adolescent being rejected, left out, as it were. And so this friendship stuff, this relationship that Jesus invites us to, he continually tells us that in Scripture, that if you're going to be my friend, you're going to have to take up your cross. You're going to have to drink the cup of suffering. He keeps using those illustrations. And like James and John in the gospel a couple of weeks ago, we say, oh, sure, no problem. But when the time comes, I go for my self-defense, go for the safe harbor, as it were. And often I have to learn the hard way. And I find myself rejecting God, making choices that are more self-directed. Confirmation is supposed to be a reminder, both sides again. God, his love, his friendship has been constant all the way through, from conception to now at 13, 14. It's me that's inconsistent. It's me that needs to grow. It's me that needs to work at it. I have to consciously make choices that the world is not focused on me. And if I have faith, if I believe God is present, that gives me an even greater motivation to do that. It's not simply to get along. It's not simply to fit in. It's not simply to gain advantage in business or whatever it may be. But I'm making choices on a moral basis. This is where God is. This is what I believe I must do in life, no matter what the other things, the externals are, and no matter what my age. But it's never ending, and it's hard. And it needs God's presence. I need his help. And so we have the sacraments of baptism, of Eucharist, and of confirmation. We've been used to them our whole lives. I had two sisters who were older. I'm the baby of the family. And they were, I guess, I'm trying to think now, I should prepare. I was born in Manhattan, on actually 126th Street and Lexington Avenue. When I mentioned this in church on Sunday, Brooklyn, everybody asked where. Well, that's where I was born. And at age 3, we moved to Brooklyn. My sisters had been born in New York. They were baptized and confirmed the same day. Now, they just passed on in their 90s, so you can go back to 1928, 1931, something like that. Why was that practiced in the I have no idea. I mean, I was baptized, and then confirmation came in 7th grade. Why was the difference? The community had a different practice. They had a different experience of the evolution of the sacraments. But the explanation of God, love, constant, always there, that remains the same. How I practice it, how I experience it, how we celebrate it, how what I'm doing in celebration is supposed to be reflecting what I believe to be the sacrament. And so Eucharist, we can go to Mass, we can understand that. But remember this, Vatican Council II comes along, and Pope John the 23rd says we have to open the windows in the church, which means that things became stagnant. I'm not going to get into the chapter and verse, but he winds up calling this council that goes on for 4 years. And it's called in 61 or 62, and finally it publishes its documents in 65. The point I'm trying to make now is that what that council did was different from the Council of Trent. That what Trent said was, you're believing this, this, this. If you believe this, you're wrong. You're excommunicated. It was all juridical. There's none of that in Vatican II. They're looking at how to make the church, as we understand it, a community that we're all united in baptism in God's love. That what Jesus wants from us is not just Catholic, but he wants us to love and be witnesses to every person. And so it opens the doors of the church, as it were. And that's where we find the idea of sacraments being utilized. That's why the Mass was changed. I just said it. Now I'm in trouble. Mass wasn't changed. That's why the externals were changed. I grew up in Trent. It was all Latin. And remember, now I'm not making judgments, but remember this. The priest, I said Mass 4 years in the Latin Rite. The priest would be standing up facing the altar, and everybody would be out there, and half of it, except for the going to the pulpit and reading the gospel and giving perhaps a homily on Sunday in the vernacular English, everything else was Latin and facing the wall. And except for turning around going Dominus Vobiscum, everything was kind of mumbled. And people were not, everybody that went to church, when I was growing up, you get the missal, and you'd be able to read, you could follow, because he's going in Latin. And I could hear him follow. My grandmother said the rosary. Her generation, never said the rosary. People said that. People were not engaged so much. And then the bells would ring and say, well, this is the consecration. I said, go back to St. Rosary. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, and now, then communion time comes, we receive communion, come back, kneel down, go home. Done. Great. Oh, pray for Russia, and then finish. Now, was there anything wrong with that? No. It's just a way of, the priest was saying Mass. I'm attending, I'm assisting, I'm not really there. I'm not really participating. And what the Vatican Council tried to do is say, it's supposed to be a Eucharistic meal. We're all sharing. And so we'll turn it around, put it in the vernacular, so you can understand and participate and really, in a sense, concelebrate. Because what is the community? What is it that unifies us? It's the presence of Jesus, Eucharist in you, and so forth. It really doesn't change what it's been going on since the Last Supper, but it changes my understanding of it. And it's supposed to change my participation in my heart. And so when I find people complaining about, not so much, but once in a while, they took Latin away, it ruined it. Well, okay, I understand what you're saying, but they didn't ruin it. Jesus is still there. But I'm not getting entertained. I'm not being elevated. I think Latin probably was more dramatic, more devotional, perhaps. Fine. But that's not what the Mass is supposed to be. It's supposed to be me participating and being nurtured and realizing that when I'm here in St. Bridget's, I'm connected, that sign from Brooklyn in 1945, that I'm connected with everybody in the world, everybody, because of God's love. Wow. I have to work on that. I have to pray. And if I believe that, it moves me out of my little safe little niche, and I become more responsible for others. God is there for me, not someone I have to earn, but someone I have to accept. So it really does change everything if I work at it. My tendency is to slip back to self-absorption. I'm talking about me. That, my world, my priesthood, my parish, I would say that so often when I became pastor in 1980, consciously aware, because I was warned, I'd say it's my parish. I'd say, no, it's not. Although I acted like it was. Not my parish. It's our parish. It's difficult for me to remember that. Difficult for people to accept that sometimes and remember it. But if I celebrate the Eucharist with that mentality, if I experience penance, but we're going to do that next week. If I approach those sacraments the way they should be approached, I'll be reminded of it always. So what is a sacrament? It's an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. An outward sign, water, words, imposing, oil, all of those things we mentioned, in a church, with a priest, with the bishop, with whatever, all of those things, they're supposed to be reflecting what I believe, what I'm doing. They're supposed to make it tangible. From God's point of view, it's always there, always loving, always present. I have to work at that too, accepting that, believing that, living it. But so it's an outward sign instituted by God. All of it comes from God to give grace, a mysterious sharing in his life, which is love. Definition is good. It's centuries old, but I have to update it. I have to realize that it's all gift. And the question is, do I accept it?